It is a real treat and an honor to welcome Peter Blauner back to the Poison Pen. His new novel, Proving Ground, is really a tour de force. And I was gushing all over him in the back room. We were talking about punk rock music and all kinds of interesting things back there. But please help me give him a nice warm welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, and it's great to be back here at this store. I really have a great affinity for Barbara and all the people who work here, and for the store in general, for supporting writers like me who are trying to keep a certain tradition alive. And so with your permission and patience, I'd like to read you a short section from this new book. Just a warning, there is bad language in this, and I'm not just talking about my prose style. But we're in Arizona. You guys can handle that, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, some of you talk that way even, right? All right. And I'm not even going to set this up because it should work out of context. All right. Wan sunlight sifts its way through the woods, gradually finding spider webs, bug swarms, and Nathaniel Dresden, a.k.a. Natty Dread, standing behind his old staff sergeant, J.R. Cuddy. Hey, Cuddy, isn't it a little early for hunting season? Yes, sir, Cuddy says in his I-95 South drawl. But we have an unusual situation of what you call your feral pigs eating up all the seedlings in the area. They're staring at bushes by a stream littered with crushed Red Bull cans, Jolly Rancher wrappers, and torn-up skunk cabbage. Feral pigs. Some people call them wild boar, but that seems kind of, I don't know, over-dramatic. Cuddy tongues a wad of tobacco under his lip. We probably won't run into them, but if we do, some of them weigh 200-300 on the hoof, tusks like little scimitars, and they have been known to run in packs of 50, 100. So, you might want a book if that happens, Lieutenant. And what are you going to do? Cuddy turns to face him, a touch on the joystick, swiveling the wheelchair with compartments for beer and ammunition. A Rebel Army forage cap sits on his head, and an AR-15 lies across the empty space where his lap would have been. Oh, don't worry about me, LT, he says, squeezing the grip. I should be able to keep them pinned down while you haul ass this time. Natty rubs the back of his neck and looks away. Cuddy could smell the desperation on him. Natty knew he should have softened up the ground a little before he needed something from a man who'd lost pretty much everything from the waist on down. There's an argument that says, maybe I should have brought the dog, Cuddy goes on. The downside is some of your blue-tick coon hounds have what you'd call a tendency to overestimate their abilities, especially when it comes to taking down a larger animal. They'll charge right in, get themselves torn to shreds by the hog, and you wind up over them laying down suppressive fire. Natty puts his hands in his pockets, arching his back. Man, he is really going to make me work for this. Thing is, the boars, if you will, don't have any business here. Cuddy pets the stock. They are not native to our area. Like us in Iraq. You're not really comparing us to pigs, Staff Sergeant, are you? I'm not into metaphor, LT. I'm just talking about things that don't belong. Theory is, some rich fool brought them to his farm when they were cute little piglets. Then let them go, because he couldn't manage. And when those hogs go wild, they grow hair, turn black, sprout tusks, ruin everything for everyone. Pull up the grass, foul the pools, push out the other animals. Gets to where you got no choice except to start killing them. Cuddy takes a flask out of his shirt pocket, unscrews the cap, pours what is no doubt Jameson Irish whiskey into his beer, and takes a deep chug, as if daring Natty to give him grief about drinking this early with an assault weapon in his hands. But I'm guessing you didn't come to talk about feral pigs. I need a gun, Cuddy. A rustling in the grass 100 yards away produces only a scurrying black squirrel. You taken up hunting? You told me you had a Glock 17, a Remington 700, and a Smith & Wesson 38 back at the house, didn't you? Uh-huh. Cuddy moves the chaw around inside his mouth. I've been hunting since I was 6. My daddy bought me my first rifle when I was 9. But I'm guessing your daddy wasn't the type to take you to a lot of gun shows. No, he was not. Then let's just cut to the chase, Hoss. You want this gun for protection, or what? A northern breeze carries the smells of beast shit and pesticides from the farm down the road. I have a situation, Staff Sergeant. Better if I don't get into specifics. Permission to speak freely, sir? Cuddy pushes back the bill of his cap. We're not in uniform anymore, and you didn't exactly hold back when we were. That's right. The wheelchair makes a whinging sound as Cuddy nudges the joystick. I always said I wouldn't bullshit you if you didn't bullshit me. That was our deal right from the get when you came in. Mr. Butterbar, 2nd Lieutenant, Artisanal, Lesbo, Cornell University, or wherever the fuck you went, Army intelligence pussy, never heard a shot fired in anger in his whole sorry, panty-waist vegan life, and I was just an ignorant gearhead redneck who barely graduated high school and happened to know 5 times more about combat than you ever will. I remember. Then why don't you just stop jerking me and tell me what's up? You heard what happened to my old man. Cuddy spits out what looks to be a half pint of tobacco juice. Yeah. Sorry about that, dog. I think I know who did it. Cuddy lets that sit a while, watching dragonflies hover above ruts filled with standing rainwater. Okay. Why don't you just tell the police? The guy who did it is too wired. They'll never get him. So you think I'll give you a gun? Why? Because I'm supposed to owe you something. I did save your life. Cuddy makes his eyes as narrow as razor cuts. Then let me remind you, we had a deal, LT. When we heard how the Hajis were angling explosives, we said if one of us lost his junk, the other would finish the job. Or did you forget? No. I didn't forget. Sometimes, in fact, it feels like he was the one who got cut in half. 1 minute they'd been in the Humvee talking about hockey and the difficulty of getting laid in Iraq, and the next he was lying in the sand, eyes burning, and black smoke drifting up through the desert palms. It was like they'd driven into the middle of the sun and wound up on the other side of the universe. All normal laws of time and space suspended. Everything seeming to happen too slow and too fast at the same time. His left shoulder dislocated, blood dripping into his eye, blurring his vision, his eardrums ringing, the ground around him seeming to carbonate, developing little holes in quick succession. As his brain settled, he realized that it was 7.62 rounds, chewing up the dirt around him, getting closer and closer. He remembers grabbing his weapon to fire back and catching a glimpse of Cuddy, his mind not quite able to encompass the reality, not only because Cuddy's legs somehow ended up a good 10 yards from his upper half, but because it had not happened to him instead. I didn't take that literally, Cuddy. I didn't think you did either. Oh, don't lawyer me, Natty Dread. You're goddamn right I took it literally. I hope you enjoy those pretty ribbons you got for saving me. I put them in a drawer and never look at them. It occurs to Natty that there is a very small but distinct chance that Cuddy has lured him out here to shoot him in the back of the head for welching on his promise. So, now here you are asking me for help. My father, Cuddy. How am I supposed to live with that? Oh, you can live with anything. Cuddy picks up the rifle. You know why? Because nobody pays for anything. Life is just one goddamn thing after another. Oh, you tell yourself what goes around comes around. But that's a lie. There's no divine justice program. Sometimes shit just happens, and you have to suck it up. Look at me. For a long time, I hated everything. I even hated you for saving my life. Because I knew as soon as it happened, this is it. I'm never going to walk again. I'm never going to have a kid. Hell, I'm never even going to make love to a woman again. Jesus. You really know how to sugarcoat it, don't you? But you know what, Cuddy says? It's all good. Because right now, I got the sun on my face, the wind in the trees, and this gun in my hands. And maybe, before the day is out, I can kill something, take it home, cook it in my own kitchen. And that's enough. That's enough, then I envy you. Cuddy shrugs. Leave it alone, LT. Suck it up, drive on. I can't do it, Staff Sergeant. I never gave my old man respect when he was alive. Then if I can't talk you out of it, can I tell you one thing? Cuddy looks up. Don't be sloppy. You said I'd be sloppy. Listen to me. What did the Hajis do? They watched us. They went to school on us. They learned our strengths and our weaknesses. And then they used them against us. So be the player this time, not the played. Don't let him see you coming. He had his guard down. You know how they catch these feral pigs? No. They set up a Judas pig. They catch one hog, put a radio collar on him. Then he leads the hunters to where the rest are hiding. And you're smarter than a pig, aren't you? Debatable. Look, I promise it won't come back on you. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Where would I run if it did? I got no fucking legs. They start to laugh in that down and dirty way normal people can never understand. You're going to keep after me till I say yes, aren't you? Cuddy belches. I'm going to do this, Staff Sergeant, and you're going to help me. Oh, is that a fact? After all the things we've seen and done and thought about, come on. You know you won't leave me hanging. Cuddy puts a finger to his lips, then straightens his torso, which is twice as thick and muscular as it was in Iraq. He lifts the AR-15 again, looks down the barrel, and becomes unnaturally still. Seconds pass, then a half minute. A sparrow sings. A twig snaps, and the air around a nearby cell tower hums. Then a large black boar charges from the underbrush, heading straight toward them, all shining eyes and bristling fur. The rifle cracks twice. The pig keeps running, then slows, as if it just remembered something in the bush. It falls like an overturned ottoman at a drunken dinner party, blinking without comprehension. Cuddy finishes him off with a shot to the head. It's good looking out, Staff Sergeant. Thank you, sir. Cuddy lowers the gun. Now you gonna help me get this fucker back to the house? Or are you some kind of goddamn cripple? Thank you.
Wow. We can all just go home now, can't we? Yeah, I mean, boy, there's so much to talk about with this new book. First of all, it's been a minute. It's been, we were just talking, the last time you were here was 11 years ago.
That's right.
And, I mean, the obvious question, how have you spent the last decade? On your website, you have a really great piece, I thought, about kind of an introduction to yourself. And you talk about, you know, kind of making your way into this book slowly.
Yeah.
And that telling detail, I think, was you mentioned somebody was giving a class or something on PTSD. And,
well, I was working for the television show Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is part of what I was doing for these 11 years I was writing for television. And two of the other writers were doing an episode that touched on veterans coming back with PTSD. And one of the experts from the VA said something about the soldier's experience in war becomes the filter through which he sees civilian life. And that may sound like an obvious observation, but when she said that, a door opened a little bit for me, because I never considered the possibility of writing any kind of a war novel because I didn't serve myself. And at first I felt like I don't have the right, as someone who hasn't seen combat, to write about combat. But then I realized I was actually not wanting to compete with all the great writers who actually have seen combat and come back and written about it, going back to Tolstoy, Norman Mailer, and even the contemporary generation of writers like Matt Gallagher and Phil Clay. And I didn't think I could compete with those guys. But then when she said that, I thought I could write maybe about someone coming back, about that transition. And when I thought about it in those terms, that seemed very much in line with the kinds of characters that I've written about in the other books. Like I've written about somebody getting out of prison after 20 years, going in when he's 17, getting out when he's 37, and waking up from that Rip Van Winkle experience. And so this character just seemed like a continuation of that idea. And then I spoke to a veteran who's struggling with PTSD, and goes, you know what it is? Like, you'll just be driving down the street and you'll see just a garbage bag lying in the street, and I'll swerve around it, because in my mind it's an IED, it's an explosive device. And I was like, well, given the experience that you're describing, that seems like a normal reaction. And when I said that, I realized, I could actually understand what this guy's going through. I mean, I'm not saying that being a writer puts you on the same level as somebody who's had that experience, but it gave me a way to begin to, see the world through those eyes, which is absolutely necessary for me if I'm going to write a book. I mean, these books have a murder, and the murder gets solved, but that's not as important to me personally as feeling like I've got a character who I can really empathize with, and who I can get on the level with.
It's funny, I saw an interview with Carl Marlantes, I guess is his name.
Great.
Who wrote that book, Matterhorn. I don't know if anybody's read that. But he was talking about how that kind of manifested itself in his own life, the PTSD. And
right.
he said that one time he was just in his kitchen, and he was reaching to get something up in the cupboard. His family's sitting there, and he bumped his head, and it startled him. And before he knew it, before he was aware of what he was doing, he'd ripped the cabinets out of the wall.
Yeah.
Or, somebody behind him on the freeway honked their horn before he was aware of what he was doing. He was on the guy's windshield.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing.
Right. It was when people began to talk to me about those ordinary life experiences that when my friend said, whenever somebody's tailgating me, I'll hit the brakes. And it's like, okay, I can be that guy. It'll take me a while, but I can be that guy, because it's all about finding a unique angle on the world, because my attitude is I'm not an expert in anything. I don't know more about anything than anybody else, except the way my particular characters experience reality. And so I always have to find one character who's got a different view of this room than the rest of us might have, and who might look at everything that's here in a way that's truly unique. And when I began to think about the experience of the veteran returning home, that's what it was.
So was that just that one simple little nugget that
it was the garbage
telling
bag.
Detail?
Yeah, it was the garbage bag on the street that made me feel like, okay, maybe I can eventually get here. But that wasn't it just by itself. Once I saw that opening, then I really committed myself to spending a lot of time with people who've had that experience. And I went to Walter Reed, and I spent some time with the guys. It was mostly men who I met there, and they were generous enough to share their stories and their experiences. And I try and approach these books like a method actor, that I just try and slip into the character and just think about their reality day after day after day until it becomes second nature, and I don't have to, be self-conscious about it anymore. And then once I'm there, now I'm ready to write the book, and the plot and everything else will fall into place after that.
You mentioned in this piece that you kind of started out wanting to be a writer, and you had this realization that, I'm not going to be this wonderful rock musician that I thought I was going to be, or this,
the hands
these grandiose
weren't getting with the program at all. Yeah,
right. And so you went
the
about.
looks weren't getting with it either. But
you mentioned, you wanted to become you became a journalist for a while, a reporter.
Yeah, I did my apprenticeship under a great writer named Pete Hamill. He was a wonderful New York journalist who wrote a great book called A Drinking Life, and he taught me the things that I really needed to know as a writer within the first 2 weeks that I met him when I was 19 years old. He said, when you have an experience, commit it to paper within 24 hours and commit every single detail that you can remember about the experience to paper, because even if it seems insignificant, you will look back 6 months or 3 years from now and you will realize, oh, that ceramic cat on the cabinet, that's the detail that told everything, because it was somebody's grandmother who gave him that cat, and then the whole story comes together.
Even though you didn't recognize it at the time.
Yeah, at the time. As long as you have the record on paper, you have the means to retrieve that. And if you haven't been paying attention and being observant, you will never get that back at that moment. And the other thing that he taught me, there were two other things they taught me. When you are interviewing somebody, at a certain point in the interview, a question will occur to you, and you will be reluctant to ask it because it will be uncomfortable. And that means you must ask that question. You may want to make it the last question because the response may be, get the hell out of this office. But more often I have found in my life, it's the beginning of a more honest conversation. And the question is formed in your mind because the other person really wanted you to ask that question. And somehow they transmitted that to you. And the third thing, and I always forget to say this, is he said, it's very important to be able to talk to anybody. It's very important to suspend your own judgments and your own attitudes. It's very important when you're writing a fictional character also. And to, not impose your own morality on other people, just to sort of hear them out. So it's very important to be able to spend all night talking to a cop or a criminal in a bar. He said, but it's also very important to come home the next night and stay up reading Anna Karenina, and to be able to be a reader at the same time. And if you can balance the two things, maybe someday you might be a writer.
You mentioned Hamill. Were some of the other kind of great journalists, I'm thinking of Liebling and Joseph Mitchell and some of those guys.
I read a lot of those guys, but it was always, I wanted to be a novelist, and I wanted to be a realistic urban novelist. And so journalism was a means to get there, because I didn't want to just write a snow on the tennis court kind of book. You know what I mean?
Angst of the Ivy League professor kind of thing.
I wasn't going to do that, and I wasn't going to do Catcher in the Rye. So I needed to find out how the real world worked, and I needed an excuse to go through people's front doors and to sit on their couches and to talk to them. And being a journalist gave me a reason to be able to do that.
And also growing up, formative years in the 70s in New York City, when we were talking about that in the back room a little bit. How much, I'm sure it was hugely influential to your work.
Yeah, because I couldn't wait to go home and tell people the interesting things that I would see on the street. I think, other people talk about the moment when they became a writer was when they read To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. The moment I decided I want to become a writer was Mother's Day, and I went into a department store called Gimbel's, and I wanted to buy my mother a gift. And I turned around, and there was a 4-year-old girl with her nanny standing in the middle of the shop floor. And the 4-year-old girl started to pull down her underwear, and the nanny said, "Stop that, you're as bad as your mother." And no, but I was so eager, I realized, this is a story. I really want to tell people this story. That's when I decided I want to be a writer.
Well, your first novel, Slow Motion Riot, that was the first, right?
Yeah.
Before Casino Moon. Okay.
Yeah.
Did pretty darn well. Won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best First Novel.
Yeah.
How did you go about kind of just backing up a little bit? How did you get that book published? How did you...
Well, it was a lot of trial and error, and there were a lot of other books that just ended up in a desk drawer, and that no one ever read. But I decided at a certain point that because I wasn't going to write a woe is me adolescent novel, that the character's job would be the source of the theme, the plot, the language, and the characters in the story. So I had to find a job that was interesting enough that I could make a book about it. And so as I was working at New York Magazine as a journalist, there used to be a city directory, and I would go through the city directory and look through jobs that I hadn't seen written about in novels, and and I would write stories about people who had these jobs, and see if it was interesting enough. Like there was one story that I did about a bingo inspector. Can you believe there was a division of bingo in New York City? And so this guy just went around to bingo halls and had all kinds of interesting adventures in the gambling dens of Brooklyn and then Queens. But that wasn't enough for a novel. And then one day I did a story about a probation officer, and I thought, well, this is interesting because at the time the prisons were overcrowded, so everybody was getting probation. So it was white-collar criminals who were convicted for insider trading. It was also street kids who were selling crack, and then there were some middle-class people who were kleptomaniacs. So I said, this guy's little office is a social microcosm. And the probation officer himself was an interesting divided character, because on the one hand he was like a social worker who was supposed to be trying to help these people, but then if he screwed up, he became the hammer, he became the cop, and he sent them to prison, basically. And even the very specific language that they were using was very powerful and revealing. He would say, now I'm going to violate you. And that made the relationship very, very highly charged. So I took a leave of absence from New York Magazine when I decided that this is what I could commit myself to, and I became a volunteer probation officer for 6 months, just so I could really write about the experience in as much detail with as much realism as I could, and that eventually became the novel. And that was a great example of Pete's thing of like write down every single thing that happens, because I did that. Like, I would come back at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would force myself to stay up and just get everything down on paper for 3 hours, and then I would take 2 years and shape that into a book.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned somewhere that you were sort of brought up on the tough, terse, private eye kind of guys.
Yeah.
But then it was really interesting insight. You said, and as I got older, I realized that Edith Wharton was really as tough and terse as those guys.
Yeah,
a lot of the stylistic stuff was just shtick or just style.
Yeah. Well, the older I get, the more I realize that women are tougher and smarter than men in a lot of ways.
Amen.
And I appreciate a wider range of writers than I did. I mean, the breakthrough had to be Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and all those guys, and that language. I mean, when you hear it for the first time, it's like hearing rock and roll for the first time. You go, look, yeah, I want to do that, and it seems deceptively simple. Like it seems like anybody could do it, but once you really start to break it down, you realize it's very, very difficult to do. And what Hemingway did in the short stories is also very, very difficult to do. But it seems achievable when you're 16 years old. Once you continue to write and continue to know a wider range of people, and because I'm delving into other people's lives, I've gotten interested in a wider range of writers, and come to appreciate Jane Austen, who I didn't get at all when I read her when I was 14, and is actually kind of hard-boiled in her way as well.
Who else do you read these days? Who are your influences right now, would you say?
Well, it's funny because people kind of go like, what's your favorite book? And to me, I don't know what you guys would say. to me, it changes all the time because it depends upon what age I am when you ask me. Like, what my favorite book was when I was 14 is not my favorite book now, and was not my favorite book when I was 35. And it's going to sound very, very pretentious, but I read a lot. I read Tolstoy these days, because when you actually read some of Tolstoy's stuff, it's actually not that high-minded. A lot of it's like really messy and human and passionate and angry and has elements that I recognize from crime fiction, and anything that has a moment that was written 100 years ago that still seems as alive today, I'm interested in. I was reading, sometimes I find myself reading on my iPhone. I'll download stuff on the iPhone, and I was reading a story called Man and Master, and I was reading because I was trying to get back to sleep, and it was the middle of the night, and there's this wonderful scene that he's writing about where this crooked businessman goes out into the woods trying to make a great business deal to buy a forest, and he finds himself in the midst of a blizzard, and he's lying down in the sled, and the snow is falling down on his face, and it's covering him, and he looks up at the sky, and he tries to tell himself that it's going to be okay. I see the sky is brightening, morning will be coming soon, I just have to get through a few more minutes. And then he takes out his watch, and he sees it's 10 after midnight, and it's like, I'm not going to make it through this night. Well, we've all had that feeling, right? Like, just so anything that just touches me in that way, that's what I'm looking for.
Gotcha. Now, getting back to Proving Ground, let's talk a little bit about this Natty
Yes.
Dread.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about him and kind of where he comes from.
Well, that came from another direct experience that I had, real life experience. From being a reporter and from being the kind of novelist who does a lot of interviewing, I know a wide range of people. I know a lot of cops. I know a lot of prosecutors. I know a lot of defense attorneys. I know people who've been in the criminal justice system as defendants. And I was walking down the street, and I ran into somebody who I know pretty well, who's a well-known civil rights attorney. And I was asking about his family, and he mentioned that his kid was working at a prosecutor's office over the summer. And I said, well, that's a real act of rebellion. He said, yeah, she knows what the people I represent are like sometimes. And I thought, well, what if you took that a step further? What would be the ultimate act of rebellion? And then that hooked up with this idea that I'd had thinking about writing about a veteran and all that. And then I began to think, okay, if it's a father-son relationship, which is, always good for me and always something that I'm interested in exploring. If it's about a father who's a well-known defense attorney, a well-known civil rights attorney whose son has rebelled against him and gone into the army, and they've been estranged, and what happens if the father dies? And the only way for the son to resolve the relationship is to find out who killed his father. Well, then you've got a real narrative going there. But then when I really began to delve into it, I realized, well, I'm coming pretty close to the plot of Hamlet as well, which was an interesting parallel. And then I went back and I reread Hamlet as part of the research for the book, and it hadn't really occurred to me before that Hamlet himself is a veteran. It's only mentioned right at the beginning of the play, but he's just back from the war. And so you could have an interpretation of the play that the whole encounter with his father's ghost and all that could be a manifestation of PTSD. And then once I began to think about it in that way, then a whole new level of the book began to unfold for me. And it became much more interesting for me to write, rather than, I hope I know, after all, writing for all these television shows and writing these books, I hope I know the basics of writing a murder story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I spend a lot of time with cops, and I went to the precinct in my neighborhood, in the 78th precinct, where they showed me the cell that Al Capone was locked up in. And so I can sort of navigate my way around that part of the story, but I always have to feel like I'm giving people, or at least trying to give people, something that they haven't gotten in other books.
Well, the father and the son is a nice kind of role reversal, of course, because you're used to the father being the stern, authoritarian, conservative kind of guy, and in this case, he's sort of the hippy dippy, vegan kind of. Was that father the attorney based on anybody in particular, or inspired?
It's based on a group of guys that I know who are like. Then maybe
do they recognize themselves, you think?
They haven't said anything yet. I'm hoping.
We're on TV here, so they're probably not watching.
But I mean, I never write one-to-one. This character is this guy that I know, because I just get too self-conscious about it, and I need the freedom to make people. My mother always says to me, "Why don't you write about me? You should write about me in my books." I'm like, because I'd have to say something terrible.
How do you know I haven't, Mom?
You're right.
Well, so you have these two police characters, and in particular, there's a female detective, Lourdes. I always get that name pronounced wrong. Lourdes? Yeah.
Lourdes is
Latina.
But also a double meaning, obviously, because I'm thinking of Lourdes,
right?
Obviously, as well. A place to go for healing, because she's had traumatic experiences herself, and also Maddie, who is both the object of her suspicion and sometimes the object of her sympathy, and then the object of her suspicion again, is someone obviously in need of healing as well. So I thought that was an interesting, complex relationship. And then she also has a relationship of a kind with a much older detective named Kevin Sullivan, who's someone who's right at the end of his career, who's got nearly 40 years on the job, and someone who harbors some deep secrets of his own. And they have what at times is a father-daughter relationship, and what at other times seems to lurch toward a quasi-romantic relationship, and I'm not going to say how that resolves itself. And Sullivan is very much like a lot of the cops that I know. He's very closely based on a lot of the older detectives who are friends of mine, frankly. But the interesting thing about Lourdes is, unlike all these other characters that I'm talking about who are largely based on research that I've done, she's not like anybody that I know. She just kind of came fully formed into my head, and I heard her voice, and I started writing about her. And sometimes those are the most successful characters that just demanded to come into existence, and I can't trace where they come from at all.
What a gift.
Yeah, well, the other weird thing that's happened, and this has happened to me over and over again, and I think it's happening again this time, is that sometimes I will write a character, and then after the book is written, I will meet the character, a real person who is not only very much like the character in terms of biographical details, in several cases the exact same name as the character. Like, when I wrote Slow Motion Riot, the antagonist in the book is a young man named Darrell King, and there's a probation officer named Stephen Baum, and one of his clients is a very violent young man named Darrell King. And after the book came out, I got a letter from, I think it was called the Frankfurt Behavioral Modification Center in Kentucky, which is, of course, a prison, and said, "Dear Mr. Blauner, I read your book. I really related to the situation your characters were in. Yours, Darrell King." And I was like, that's interesting. Then years later, the last book that I wrote before Proving Ground was called Slipping into Darkness, and as I mentioned earlier, that's the one about somebody who goes into prison when he's 17 and gets out when he's 37. And I said to a friend of mine who had a lot of experience being in prison, frankly, "Can you introduce me to somebody who's done that kind of a stretch and started when he was that young?" He said, "Yeah, Darrell King." I'm like, "Is he from Kentucky?" He's like, "No." I'm like, "Are you sure his name's Darrell King? You're not just talking about the character from my book?" He's like, "Yeah, Darrell King." So I met Darrell King, and I had to bring a copy of the book because several things in the book are exactly the same as his life, and I had to say, "Dude, I'm not basing this on your life at all. It's just like this weird coincidence." It's happened 2 or 3 other times
Now, was he kind of out of central casting, or were his experiences quite unique and therefore stranger to be?
His experiences were invaluable when it came to writing that next book, because I said, what's the difference between when you went in and when you got out 20 years later? He said, well, women are different now. I said, what do you mean women are different? Women have stuff, 2 arms, 2 legs. He goes, no. He said he had actually done 25 years, and he went in 1969, he got out in 1994. He said the way they carry themselves in the street, the way they look at you, their confidence, it's just different than it is now. I said, all right, so what else is different now? He said, really? White people can dance now. He said, well, when I went away, they danced like Frankenstein, and I went to a club the other night, and now they could do the reggae, they could do the funk. It was, so that's the other thing you always look for when I do this research. I'm always looking for somebody to say something I couldn't have predicted they were going to say at all. Because otherwise, I'm borrowing from movies or from television shows or from other books, and you've been there before. I want to give you some way to see life in a slightly different way, if even just for one page.
Now, as you mentioned, you've done quite a bit of TV work.
Yeah.
Just give us the lowdown. What sort of work have you done over the years?
I caught on with a show called Law and Order: Criminal Intent because a friend of mine, Eric Bogosian, got cast in the show, and he introduced me to the showrunner, Warren Light, and I happened to remember a story that I had reported on a little bit back in 1988 that happened to break down into a 4-act structure of the kind they use on Law and Order. And I did the spec script, and we ended up filming it, and they hired me full-time. And so I worked for that show. Then I worked for a show that no one watched called Law and Order Los Angeles. It had a great cast, but no one watched it.
Who was in it?
Alfred Molina, Terrence Howard, Corey Stoll, who was a great actor, and it just didn't work, frankly. And then I went over to Law and Order SVU, and I worked there for 3 years, and I really have a lot of respect and admiration for the star of that show, Mariska Hargitay. Is really a great person, and also good actress, and has a terrific documentary coming out called I Am Evidence. So I really enjoyed working with some of the people over there. And then I took a year off to really break the ground and write this book, Proving Ground, because it was just driving me crazy not to have a novel out there and not to be writing novels, because like we were talking about, I mean, you can have fun working on these television shows, and it's a great collaborative experience, and collaboration was new to me, but it's not the same thing as having the opportunity to communicate from the little space in my head to the little space in your head, which can only come when you're writing a book. I mean, television's gotten a lot better, with some of the cable shows especially, at recreating some of the novelistic experience, but that very personal thing, I don't think a camera can ever capture.
Can I ask you a writerly question?
Sure.
I was telling him in the back room,
that
that you guys are in for a treat with this book, because it's like line by line, it just is so, the language is so crisp and crackles. And what's your relationship like with your copy editor?
It's pretty good, but what I do, and again, I think Pete might have told me to do this, but I picked it up somewhere else. I make myself read the entire book out loud before I turn it in, because and it takes a long time. It can take, like this is a manuscript for this book was like 450 pages before I cut it down. But when you read a sentence out loud, if you have trouble saying the words, the problem is not with the sentence usually. The problem is with the idea behind the sentence. And the only way to really discover that, I find, is to say it out loud and to expose it to sunlight. And also, you just catch repetition, vagueness, Sometimes the opposite, overloading a sentence with details and clauses, which I found myself doing a lot this time, because I've been writing for television, and you have to write in such a spare way when you write TV scripts, that I wanted to react against that completely when I was writing the book. And I may have gone overboard, so I ended up having to cut out a lot of stuff at the last minute here. So my copy editor is very tolerant of me, but the other great thing about books, and it's a major difference between books and writing for television, is when I write a book, I'm trying to present the absolute best version of it right up until the very last minute. I mean, I'll keep rewriting, I'll keep doing research, I'll keep, going out and trying to have experiences so I can get the absolute, best until the very end. People would kill you if you did that in television, because there's location scouts, there's directors, there's producers, there's actors who need to memorize lines. They need the script to be set at a certain point, and they need you to take your hand off it at a certain point so they can begin to have their creative engagement with the process.
Now, there's an awful lot of it seems anyway, very specific slang in this book. About how these guys talk and interact with each other.
Right.
As a longtime reporter and writer, do you always have your ear out for that phrase?
Raymond Chandler said the only slang you should use is the kind that's in such common usage that everyone will know what it means, or the kind that you make up yourself. And I try to subscribe to that, but then sometimes if words just have their own texture and poetry, I get attracted to them in and of itself. And so I listen for those phrases that just jump out. Like the word gat has come back into fashion again as a street slang expression for a gun, and that's from Raymond Chandler, and that's from Dashiell Hammett. But you'll hear it in rap music these days. So I always feel that you have to deliver at multiple levels when you're asking people to invest the time and effort to read a book. So I'm trying to give you a character, and I'm trying to give you a story, but also I'm trying to give you texture with the language as well.
And there's also very specific vocabulary that these veterans speak, that normal civilian folks don't know.
Butter bar.
Yeah.
And that I had to spend time with the guys to pick it up. And I can't do it as well as those guys do it. And so I tried to replicate it enough that it felt real without going all the way into the actual thing, because I get lost. And also, when you really hear the actual thing, it's hard to understand.
Well, anybody have any questions? I'm sure you do, right? Come on.
Yeah, killing your darlings gets very, very difficult, and a lot of stuff stays in until the very last minute. It's really that reading it out loud is the very final stage, because you've been reading it visually for a while, and it's easy to fall in love with certain sections when you're just reading them, and then when you hear them out loud, it breaks your heart to kind of go, that beautiful story. In particular, in this book, there was an anecdote in the first chapter that was told to me by a detective that almost was like a short story in and of itself, of how he discovered a murder victim was actually a suicide. And I won't tell the whole story here, but he told it in a very lyrical way, and I recreated that. And then when I looked at the scene, I was like, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It's its own world, and it's getting in the way of the rhythm of this scene here, and it took reading it out loud to be honest enough with myself to say, okay, it's got to go.
It has to serve the story.
Yeah, but it has to serve the story, or it has to serve the theme, or it has to illuminate the character. that has to serve the story thing you hear a lot in television, particularly in the Law and Order shows that I was working for, where they really just go, I don't want to hear about the character's home life. I don't. If you put in a joke, the editor usually will take it out, and so I try not to be too slavish to the serve the story thing. I try and serve the story in the larger sense that story can also mean character and the world in which my characters live in.
Now, in writing for TV, do you go back to your fiction, or has that had an effect on the way you kind of write your novels?
Well, just being around a lot of smart people who have opinions has allowed me, I hope, to internalize their impatience, if that makes any sense at all. It's I hope made me less self-indulgent in a way, while like very politely keeping them outside the room and having enough space to do what I want to, if you know what I mean. The first job I ever had, first real job I ever had, was I was a good humor man, and I worked on 3rd Street in Manhattan, across the street from the Hells Angels garage, and
They come over for their ice cream?
yeah, occasionally, yeah. But I only ate chocolate eclair myself. So when I went to work as a good humor man, it was the first time I had to go, what do other people eat? I was 16 years old, and it was the first time I really had to consider other people's point of view. And so working for a television show is kind of like that. Like, okay, I'm not necessarily going to do exactly what you want me to do, but at least I'm aware of your point of view. I'm aware of how you're looking at this, and it makes me be tougher on myself, and hopefully, raises the standard a little bit. Blue Bloods. But I'm taking off this first part of next season so I can write another novel, because 11 years between novels is more than I can contend with.
Have any of your books been adapted?
Not. They've all been adapted. They've all been optioned or bought, and there have been numerous screenplays written. None of them have been produced. I had a great experience with Casino Moon, working with a guy named James B. Harris, who was Stanley Kubrick's producer for Kubrick's first 3 great movies, The Killing, Paths of Glory, and Lolita. And Jimmy's also a director himself. He directed The Bedford Incident and Boiling Point. And he had a lot of good Sterling Haynes stories. He had some good Jim Thompson stories, because Jim Thompson wrote the screenplay for Paths of Glory. But he also taught me how to think structurally as a screenwriter. But he also, when we finished the draft of the screenplay, he said, all right, this is the last page, this is the last line of dialogue. Now I'm going to tell you what Stanley told me when we finished our first screenplay together. I said, what's that? He said, Stanley Kubrick told me we must never tell anybody what this is really about. He said, because if we do, we'll take all the mystery out of it. Like, if we don't, people will go, wow, this seems really deep, it's mysterious, and then they'll apply their own interpretation. And then anything that we say will sound dumb if we...
Think about Dr. Strangelove in that context, and...
The real story of Dr. Strangelove that he told me is, I think there was a book called Red Alert that came out in 62 or 63, and they were going to adapt Red Alert into a film. And then a movie came out called Failsafe. Remember Failsafe? And it's basically the same story, that there's like what appears to be an attack on Russia, and it causes the launch of the nuclear code and all that. And they were like, well, what are we going to do now that we've gotten this project underway? And Kubrick said, well, let's just do it as satire. It's the only thing that we can do. They'll be different from Failsafe, and that's how it became Dr. Strangelove.
Brilliant movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of Full Metal Jacket? Kind of towards the end of the.
It'd be interesting to watch it again after having delved into the whole veteran thing. And my view of that movie was a little skewed because as a journalist, I didn't do that many entertainment stories, but one of the few that I did do was Platoon, right before it came out. And I spent a lot of time with Oliver Stone before it came out, and that had very much impressed me as a realistic war film. But what do I know? I mean, like at one point while I was doing that story, I talked to one of the actors, and I thought, like, what a fine, upstanding young man. I mean, this is like really, like if I ever have a son, I hope he grows up to be like this young man. And that was Charlie Sheen. So, so I don't know everything.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird coincidence. Tomorrow, Philip Caputo, who wrote The Rumor of War.
Yeah.
He has a really terrific new novel out, but he's going to be dropping by
Good.
and doing some signing. And also Michael Hare,
Sure.
the great writer of Dispatch, has recently passed away.
Yeah.
It's an interesting time. It seems like that whole Vietnam, for a long time, the guys didn't want to talk anything about it.
Yeah.
And now finally you're seeing more of that coming out.
Starting to come to the surface. Well, again, it was like a real issue for me. I really read a lot of war novels, asking myself, like, can you do this? Can you be on this territory? And once I began to say, it's not a war novel, it's a post-war novel. And I began to say, like, a lot of the noir stuff, the great noir stuff, was written around World War II. That it was written either right before the war or some of it was written after the war. And that if I started to think, like, okay, you're operating in that tradition of moral ambiguity and all that, then it became something that I felt more comfortable doing. I mean, mind you, it's not that you actually have to be there to write a war novel. I mean, Red Badge of Courage is considered to be the definitive Civil War novel, and Stephen Crane was born in 1871. So it can be done. It's just I didn't feel comfortable writing
There's
about
an Andrew Jackson joke that just wants to come up, but I'm not going to say no.
Yeah. Well, again, like the section that I just read, it's a post-war section. There's a little bit of a combat flashback in the midst of the section, but I was very conscious of trying to keep the combat scenes as close to the bone as possible and not trying to replicate the soldier's experience in the moment, because I wanted to leave that to people who've actually been there.
I mean, Madame Bovary never would have been written if you had to stick to your own experience, right?
No. Well, that somehow it's just combat is the one area that I wanted to be careful about. And again, I went there, but usually when I write these books, I am going towards characters who are very, very different from me. And in fact, the more different they are, the more fully realized they are as characters, because I'm not taking anything for granted. In fact, the characters that I think work the best for me are the ones who have a point of view that I don't agree with at all, because it forces me to really engage and to really think, like, well, why does he feel that way? How did she end up being like that? So
a lot of writers seem like they go through the autobiographical phase. Did you ever do that, or did you strictly go past that?
No. Well, the autobiography is in there, but it's so chopped up and distorted that I don't think anybody would recognize the parts of it that are in there. There's very, very, very little in any of the books that would have a one-to-one correspondence with my own life, but everything in the book has to have some emotional access point for me, or I can't make it work. Does that make sense?
Sure. I realize we haven't talked too much about the plot of this book, but we really can't. I mean, we can't give away too much here.
Well, it's a murder mystery that becomes a revenge story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I read that Lourdes, one of the characters in this book, is going to have a starring role in your next novel.
Right. Though she isn't necessarily the main character in this novel. She's one of the main characters, but it's not just her book. It's not like it's a private eye novel where she solves a case and then she's going to have another case in the next book. And there's a very definite reason for that. which is that I heard someone say very early on, a teacher that I had, books are about how people change. And Natty is someone who very much goes through a very dramatic change, a very dramatic life change in this book. And to write about a character who goes through a dramatic life change in a series of books would be writing about a character who's so unstable that it would threaten realism. So in a way, Lourdes, she does go through some changes in the book, but it's not nearly as major as what the things that Natty confronts, which are explosive and things that leave you not the same at all. There are a couple of things that happen in this book that change the course of your life, and I want to keep with the realism of that impact, whereas Lourdes is someone who you can see picking up and going on to more experiences and continuing to, embrace life in some way.
Anybody else, any final questions or thoughts? If not, okay.
It looks like you're married there. Do you show the wife excerpts from the book while you're working on it? Do you go back and forth and talk about things?
Well, my wife's a very, very good writer and a very talented writer herself. In fact, she's a best-selling author herself, and she's written a couple of mysteries. Her name's Peg Tyre. She had a big education book called The Trouble with Boys, and she herself was a crime reporter at New York Newsday, and I probably have borrowed heavily from some of her experiences over in the past, some of the books that I've written, and definitely could not have written them without her generosity and contributions. So, yeah, that you're perceptive in that way. Do we compete? She's more writes nonfiction these days, and she's more in the journalism field these days. So it's a little bit different. She had those two novels, Strangers in the Night and In the Midnight Hour, that came out in the 90s. But ever since then, it's mostly been in the journalism realm.
Your kids have the bug at all? The writing bug?
One of my kids, my older son, is a much better writer than me, and we'll see if he chooses to pursue that. But he actually read this manuscript, and some of the sharpest and most acerbic criticism I got was from him, but also some of the most useful. He's a very, very good literary critic. I mean, at times I had to tell him, like, okay, take it easy a little bit.
Back off, kid.
Try and say that in a different way. but in fact, if you read the book, there is a crucial revelation at the end of the book that was very much shaped by a note that he gave me. So I'm very lucky to have a kid who's that smart. He's not a kid. He's a young man who's that smart in my life.
Well, Peter, I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and let's give him a nice warm round of applause.
Thanks for coming, guys.
We'll have you break it up and sign some books for us.